A little girl stood trembling at the
Please
edge
don't
of the
let
Parker
them burn.
estate,
This
her
ends
small
now.
frame swallowed by the black dress that once belonged
This
to her
ends
mother.
now.
The funeral had ended hours ago, yet the cold seemed sharper now than at the graveside. 6-year-old Emma Parker clutched a frayed teddy bear against her chest, its seams splitting like her fragile sense of safety. That bear was the last
It's
gift
like I'm
from the
stuck in
mother
a
she lost in
nightmare.
a car accident. And now with her father buried beneath the frozen earth, it was the only anchor left in her collapsing world. But safety was a word that had no place in this house anymore. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Karen Parker, her stepmother, emerged from the shadows inside. At the funeral, she had wept behind a lace handkerchief, the perfect portrait of a grieving widow. But as the neighbors drifted away and no eyes were left to watch, her mask slipped. Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't warm at all. It was sharp, cruel, deliberate. Behind her, Robert Hayes, Richard's bitter younger brother, stepped forward with the swagger of a man who thought fate had finally bent in his favor. The scar along his cheek caught the dying light like a blade. "Out," Karen hissed, her voice stripped of pretense. Before Emma could protest, she felt the shove, sudden and heartless, that sent her stumbling into the snow. The door slammed shut behind her. Emma stood there, drenched, abandoned, her breath visible in the icy night. No child should ever face such loneliness. No child should learn so young that family can turn into strangers. And then, light. Headlights cut across the darkness, searing through the winter fog. Tires crunched on ice as a patrol car rolled to a stop. The door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped into view. Beside him, a German Shepherd K9 bounded forward, its eyes glinting with an instinct sharper than any man's. The dog froze, nose lifted, as if it could smell the fear and betrayal clinging to the child. Emma's grip on her teddy bear tightened. Her story was about to shift in ways no one in Springfield could have imagined, because what happened next would rip open a secret buried far deeper than grief, one that her stepmother and uncle never wanted revealed. And before this night ended, Emma Parker would no longer just be a grieving child. She would become the key to exposing a darkness that threatened them all. To many, he was the black sheep of the family, a man who squandered chances and blamed everyone else for his failures. Now standing in Richard's house, his blue eyes gleamed with a sense of triumph. Emma looked up at them, her voice trembling. Can I help clean the house, Mom?" She used the word out, of habit, though her small heart still HD at its hollowest. Karen turned, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and let out a sharp laugh. "From now on," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, "I am the lady of this house. I make the decisions. Don't pretend to be sweet to earn my pity." Emma hugged her teddy bear tighter. She did not notice Robert sinking lazily into an armchair, uncorking a bottle of whiskey, and taking a long drink. He looked her up and down, then spat on the floor. "Hello, Emma," he sneered. "From now on, I'll be here taking the place of your useless father." The words hit her like blows. Her eyes widened in fear, and she took a small step backward. "Uncle," she stammered. This is Daddy's house." Robert's laugh was harsh, the sound of glass shattering. "Your father is dead. Do you understand? This is no longer your house. You're nothing but a freeloader, a crying brat clinging to a filthy teddy bear." Karen stood up abruptly, her face twisted with cruelty. She grabbed Emma's small arm with a grip far too tight, dragging her toward the door. "I'm tired of pretending to be your kind mother," she hissed. "You are nothing but trouble. Your father died. Your mother died. All because of you. You are cursed." The child's eyes brimmed with tears. "No, please, I'll be good. Don't send me out, Mom." Karen's voice cut her off, ice cold. "Don't you dare call me Mom. You're not my blood. You're nothing to me." She yanked open the front door, the winter air slamming in. Robert followed, smirking, crushing the teddy bear under, his boot for good measure. In her other hand, Karen carried a bucket filled with icy water, fetched deliberately for this moment. Emma, trembling, tried to pull free, but Karen's nails dug into her skin. Out in the front yard, with the snow crunching underfoot, Karen hurled the water straight over Emma's head. The child shrieked at the shock, her small body convulsing from the sudden cold. Her hair clung wet to her face, her black dress soaked through until her lips turned blue. Robert crossed his arms, watching with a cruel smirk. "Look at her," he said, "no different from a stray puppy." Emma dropped to her knees, clutching the sodden teddy bear now lying in the snow. Tears spilled over her cheeks, mixing with the water. She whispered, "Daddy, where am I supposed to go now?" From the windows across the street, neighbors pee, curtains fluttered and closed again. Nobody came. Out. Nobody dared. Then, just as Karen raised her hand again, as if to strike, a sharp sound split the air, the screech of brakes. A police cruiser had pulled up abruptly at the curb, its headlights cutting through the dusk. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, Officer Daniel Harris was 36, with a frame built from years of disciplined training. He had close-cropped dark brown hair, a strong square jaw dusted with a few days' stubble, and brown eyes that carried both steadiness and a shadow of loss. Widowed 3 years earlier, after his wife had died in a car accident, Daniel had poured his pain into his work. Known for his calm under pressure and his unwavering moral compass, he was both respected and quietly feared among criminals in town. At his side leapt a dog, Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, with a thick black and tan coat and sharp amber eyes. Rex was large for his breed, nearly 85 pounds, his muscles rippling beneath his fur. Trained as a K-9 officer, he was disciplined, yet carried an uncanny sensitivity to human emotion. Daniel often said Rex could smell sorrow as easily as fear. The dog had been his partner for 4 years, and the bond between them was as strong as blood. When Daniel's eyes took in the boat scene, the shivering child, the overturned bucket, the 2 adults standing over her, his entire body went rigid. Before he could say a word, Rex moved. The dog bounded forward, teeth bared, a low, menacing growl reverberating from his chest. He planted himself directly in front of Emma, ears pricked forward, hackles raised like bristles, shielding the child from further harm. Robert instinctively stepped back, startled by the sudden flash of fangs. Karen froze, her cruel hand dropping to her side. Daniel's voice cut the air, firm and resonant. What is going on here? His gaze was fixed on the 2 adults, though he crouched slightly, one hand hovering near Rex's collar, reassuring the animal. Emma lifted her tear-streaked face, her lips trembling. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them hurt me." Daniel looked into her eyes, and, for a fleeting second, he saw himself alone, broken, longing for someone to stand between him and the cruelty of the world. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened. "This ends now," he said. And with Rex's growl echoing through the winter air, the night in Springfield shifted. The balance of power no longer in the hands of the cruel, but in the grip of justice that had finally arrived. At Emma's doorstep, the police cruiser hummed through the quiet streets of Springfield, its headlights sweeping over the silent houses. Inside, Emma Parker sat in the back seat, shivering, under a blanket Daniel had pulled from the trunk. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks, and she hugged her teddy bear so tightly. It seemed as if the toy itself was keeping her alive. Rex, the German shepherd, lay curled on the seat beside her, his body warm and solid, his amber eyes occasionally flicking toward her as though to check that she was still breathing. Daniel Harris drove with a jaw set tight. He had seen neglect before, but something about the small figure in his rear-view mirror stirred an old ache in him. His own wife had died 3 winters ago in a crash caused by a drunk driver. He had no children. The silence of his home had only deepened since her absence. Perhaps that was why this little girl's trembling face reached him so deeply. He knew the feeling of being robbed of family. When they arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, chasing away the shadows of the night. The Springfield Police Department was modest, a 2-story brick building with a lobby lined with outdated chairs and bulletin boards cluttered with flyers. The main office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. At this late hour, only a few officers remained on duty. Officer Caroline Reed looked up from her desk when Daniel walked in, Emma at his side. Caroline was in her early 42nd, a sturdy woman with short blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her face carried soft lines that spoke of years spent listening to people's troubles. She had a motherly warmth about her, though life had hardened her patience with criminals. She rose immediately, her hazel eyes widening at the sight of Emma's soaked dress and pale face. "Good Lord, Daniel," Caroline murmured, stepping forward. "What happened to her?" "Long story," Daniel replied, his voice low but steady. "She needs warmth, food, and safety for tonight. I'll file the report in a minute." Caroline crouched down so she was eye level with Emma. "Sweetheart, my name is Caroline. You're safe here." Her tone was gentle, a voice trained by raising 2 children of her own before they'd left for college. Emma stared at her cautiously, then instinctively pressed closer against Rex, burying her small fingers into the dog's thick fur. Rex remained still, not pulling away. His ears twitched, and his steady presence seemed to anchor Emma's trust. Daniel led them down a hallway to his office, a plain room with filing cabinets along one wall, and a desk that bore the neat stacks of a man who could not stand disorder. A worn leather jacket hung behind the chair. He pulled out another blanket from the closet, draped it around Emma's shoulders, then motioned for her to sit on the small couch against the wall. Rex hopped up beside her without needing instruction. The dog stretched out, letting Emma lean against his broad chest. She clung to him as though he were a shield. Slowly, her trembling subsided. Daniel crouched in front of her, his brown eyes softening. You're safe now, Emma. No one is going to hurt you here. But I need you to tell me what's been happening at home. Emma's lips parted, but no words came at first. Her eyes darted to the floor. Then, in a fragile voice, she whispered, Since Daddy got sick, Karen and Robert, they said I was the reason. They said I made everything worse. When I tried to help, they shouted or hit me. Sometimes they wouldn't let me eat until I cleaned the house. Her small hands shook as she clutched the teddy bear closer. Daddy was the only one who was kind. Now he's gone. Caroline stood quietly in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, fighting back tears of anger. Daniel reached out and placed a steady hand over Emma's. So, Emma, listen to me, he said, firmly but kindly. None of this is your fault. You did nothing wrong. What they did to you is not okay. Emma blinked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to believe the words. Silence filled the office for a moment, broken only by the faint hum of the radiator. Rex let out a quiet huff, shifting slightly so that his body pressed more firmly against Emma's side. She smiled weakly and buried her face into his fur. Daniel watched the way Rex seemed to understand. The dog had been through rigorous training, yes, but there was something beyond instinct here. It was as if Rex had chosen to be this child's guardian. Then Emma's small voice cut through again. I only have this bear. Daddy gave it to me before he got sick. She held it up, the fabric frayed, one ear loose. As she hugged it tighter, her eyes widened. It feels different inside, hard, like something is hiding. There. Daniel leaned closer. What do you mean? She pressed on the stuffing, and indeed, there was a faint resistance, a lump buried deep inside. Caroline stepped forward, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Do you think your father put something inside? Daniel asked gently. Emma nodded slowly. Daddy told me once, this bear would always keep me safe. Daniel's heart thudded with a new urgency. He knew Richard Parker had been respected in Springfield, but also that he had business rivals and had confided suspicions of being undermined. If he had hidden something inside his daughter's toy, it meant he had feared for his life. He reached for a small pocket knife, glanced at Emma. We can open it carefully, but I'll stitch it back afterward. You'll still have your bear. Is that okay? Emma hesitated, her lower lip trembling. Then she nodded. Rex gave a small wag of his tail as if offering reassurance. Daniel carefully pulled the stitches loose at the seam. The worn cotton stuffing spilled slightly, and inside his fingers brushed against something solid. He drew out a small black USB drive, no larger than his thumb. Caroline gasped softly. Emma's eyes widened. Daniel held it in his palm, staring. Looks like your father wanted someone to find this, he murmured. His gut tightened, with both dread and determination. He knew this would be more than a family dispute. It smelled like a crime hidden in plain sight. Emma hugged her bear again once. Daniel tucked the stuffing back and stitched it roughly with thread from a kit Caroline fetched. She whispered, Daddy left me something. He really did. Her small smile, though faint, was the first Daniel had seen all night. He exchanged a glance with Rex, who sat alert, ears prick-ricked, as though he, too, understood the weight of this discovery. Outside, the snow fell in silent sheets. But within the small-lit office of the Springfield Police Department, a new storm was gathering, a storm of truth, waiting to be unleashed. And nestled against Rex's steady warmth, Emma, for the first time since her father's death, began to feel the fragile flicker of safety. The office lights hummed in the quiet of the Springfield Police Department. Outside, snow drifted across the empty streets, muffling the world in a heavy silence. Inside, Daniel Harris sat behind his desk with his laptop open, the glow casting sharp angles across his jaw. Emma perched on the couch, clutching her teddy bear with its freshly stitched seam. Rex lay stretched out beside her, his ears flicking every time she shifted, his eyes half-lidded but watchful. Caroline Reed had remained, leaning against the file cabinet with her arms crossed. Her sturdy frame and non-nonsense manner often gave her a tough exterior, but in moments like these, the warmth in her hazel eyes was undeniable. She glanced at Emma, then at the small USB drive lying on Daniel's desk. Are you sure? You want to listen to this now? Caroline asked quietly. If it's what we think it is, there's no turning back. Daniel's brown eyes flicked up from the device. The moment Karen and Robert dragged a 6-year-old into the snow and poured water over her, there was no turning back. His voice carried a clipped tone, the kind forged by years of suppressing grief with duty. Emma tilted her head, confusion clouding her pale face. She sat with her knees tucked under the blanket Caroline had given her. Is it from Daddy? She asked, her voice fragile, a tremor laced in every word. Daniel softened as he looked at her. We'll find out together, Emma. He inserted the USB drive into his laptop. For a moment, the screen went blank. Then, a single audio file appeared. Its name was a simple date, time-stamped almost a year earlier. Daniel double-clicked. The speakers crackled with static before a voice filled the room. It was Richard Parker. Richard's voice was weary, almost ragged, yet still carrying the traces of authority from a man used to leading. Robert, what is this bottle of medicine? I don't need this. Every time I take it, my heart races. My chest feels tight. Where did you get this? There was a pause, then another voice, flat and chilling. Robert Hayes, doctor, prescribed it. Stop being paranoid. Just take it. You're weak enough already. A scraping sound echoed, perhaps a glass being set down. Then the third voice entered, low and venomous, whispering, close to the microphone. Karen Parker. Let him drink more. The sooner the better. Emma's face crumpled, her small hands clutching Rex's thick fur. The German shepherd, sensing her distress, pressed closer and let out a low, rumbling growl. The sound wasn't directed at the room. It was as though the dog remembered the scent and tone of Robert, and now recognized him in the recording. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth, her hazel eyes hardening into fury. My God, she whispered. They were poisoning him. Daniel's jaw tightened, the muscles along his cheek flexing as he replayed the words in his mind. He remembered Richard Parker, tall, kinded, always carrying himself with quiet dignity. Daniel had once worked a neighborhood watch event with him, and he remembered how Richard had bent down, to talk with children eye to eye, never with condescension, but with true respect. To think of that same man being betrayed in his own home in his last days, it ignited something cold and fierce in Daniel's chest. Emma pressed her face against Rex's fur, sobbing quietly. Her tears darkened the tan streaks of his coat. Rex turned his head, gently nudging her shoulder with his muzzle, as if urging her to keep breathing. Daniel shut the laptop for a moment, silencing the voices. He leaned forward on the desk, his broad hands clenched into fists. This isn't just neglect, he said in a low voice. This is premeditated. They wanted him gone for the money, the house, maybe more. And now they've turned on her. Caroline straightened, her jaw set. We'll need to open a case file. But Daniel, her voice, softened. You know what you're walking into. Robert's got friends. Karen knows how to play the grieving widow. They'll spin this however they want. Daniel's gaze flicked to Emma, who was still crying silently against Rex. The child's thin shoulders shook beneath the blanket, her fragile frame making her seem even smaller. He took a slow breath. I don't care what they spin. We have a child who needs protection and a murder to investigate. That's enough. He stood, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the office. Daniel had always been a man of principle, but there was something different now. A line had been crossed that could not be erased. He looked at Caroline. I'll start the paperwork. I'll need you to coordinate with Child Protective Services for temporary custody. Caroline nodded, her expression resolute. I'll make the call. And Daniel, don't shoulder all of this alone. You've carried enough ghosts already. For a flicker of a second, pain flashed across his face. The memory of his wife gone too soon, but he buried it quickly. I'll carry what I have to. Emma sniffled, lifting her face from Rex's fur. Her eyes were wide, glistening. Are they? Are they going to come for me again? Daniel crouched in front of her, his voice steady. Not while I'm here. Not while Rex is here. You're safe with us. Rex wagged his tail once as though sealing the promise. Emma reached out with her small fingers, brushing the edge of Daniel's uniform sleeve. Daddy, he knew, didn't he, that they were hurting him. Daniel hesitated. He couldn't lie. Not to her. Yes, Emma. He knew something was wrong, and he wanted to make sure you'd be safe. That's why he left this. She clutched the teddy bear tighter, her sobs easing into soft hiccups. He really wanted me to be safe. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but filled with unspoken vows. Daniel finally stood, his voice grim but clear. We'll open an official investigation. From this point on, everything changes. Caroline moved toward the door, her shoulders squared. I'll get started on the paperwork. Emma lay back against Rex, exhaustion pulling at her small frame. Her eyelids fluttered as the warmth of the German shepherd lulled her into half-sleep. Daniel watched as the child drifted, one hand still curled in Rex's fur, the other gripping the patched teddy bear. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal. Karen and Robert would fight. They would smear. They would deny. But for the first time, there was proof. A voice from beyond the grave, demanding justice. And for Emma, there was now a shield. A police officer scarred by loss. And a loyal dog, whose growl alone promised that she would never be alone again. The storm had broken. The fight for the truth had begun. The next morning, the Springfield Police Department bustled with a subdued energy. The snow outside had crusted overnight, leaving icy patches that glistened under the pale sun. Inside, the station hummed with the low murmur of phones, the clack of keyboards, and the smell of burnt coffee. Daniel Harris, his uniform jacket buttoned tight, sat at his desk, reviewing forms and case notes. His brown eyes were fixed, his jaw tense. On the couch in his office, Emma Parker slept lightly, curled beneath a blanket, Rex's head resting across her lap. The German Shepard's ears flicked with every sound in the building, though his body remained still, protective, his thick, black and tan coat rising and falling with calm breaths. Daniel knew the girl couldn't remain hidden forever. The audio recording was powerful, but for the case to hold, he needed witnesses, people willing to say aloud what they had seen. That was the only way to keep Emma safe and bring Karen and Robert to justice. By late morning, Daniel made his first stop, the old Parker apartment building. He knocked at the door of Unit 2B. The hinges creaked and a woman appeared. Dorothy Wilson was in her late 62nd, with neatly cropped white hair and a thin build that suggested both fragility and resilience. She wore a wool cardigan over a faded floral dress, and her pale hands clutched the edge of the door as though she feared someone might be listening. Deep lines creased her face, particularly around her gray eyes that spoke of too many nights spent awake with worry. "Mrs. Wilson," Daniel said gently, flashing his badge. "It's Officer Harris. May I come in for a word?" She hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway. Then she opened the plaid door wider. "Come in quickly, please." The small apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books. A crocheted blanket lay draped over the sofa. Dorothy gestured for Daniel to sit, but remained standing, wringing her hands. "I saw them," she blurted, her voice hushed. "That night after the funeral, I saw Karen drag the little girl into the yard. I saw Robert holding her wrist. And Karen? She had a bucket of water. She poured it right over Emma's head." Daniel leaned forward. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Dorothy's voice cracked. "Because they scare me. Karen has friends in town and Robert," she shivered. "He's cruel. I was afraid they'd come after me, but I can't keep it inside anymore." Daniel's expression softened. "Your testimony could protect Emma, Mrs. Wilson, but I understand your fear. We'll make arrangements to keep you safe." She nodded quickly, though her hands continued to tremble. From there, Daniel moved to the back alley, where a man sat hunched on a wooden crate wrapped in a tattered coat. Frank Miller was a fixture of the neighborhood. A man in his mid-52nd with a weathered face, scruffy gray beard, and eyes that carried both defiance and defeat. Once years ago, Frank had been a carpenter, but a factory accident had crushed his hand and taken his livelihood. Since then, alcohol and bad fortune had driven him to the streets. When Daniel approached, Frank squinted up wearily, but his eyes softened when he saw Rex at his side. The German Shepherd stood tall, ears erect, tail flicking in. Cautious curiosity. "Morning, Frank," Daniel said evenly. "Mind if I talk with you?" Frank chuckled bitterly, his voice rough. "You cops never come looking for me unless it's trouble. This time's different." Daniel crouched to his level. "I need your eyes. You saw what happened to Emma, didn't you?" Frank rubbed his hands together, his cracked knuckles showing raw red skin. "Yeah, I saw it. That poor girl. They dragged her like she was nothing. She slipped on the steps crying, but Robert glared at me like he'd slit my throat if I moved. I wanted to step in, but I lost enough." His voice faltered. Then, with a sudden sharpness, he added, "But that child doesn't deserve what I've had to live. If my word can help, I'll say it." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Frank. I'll make sure you're protected too." Back at the station that evening, both Dorothy and Frank were brought in to give formal statements. Caroline Reed sat across from Dorothy, coaxing her gently through the details. While Daniel oversaw Frank's testimony in the adjoining room, each account aligned. Karen had poured the water. Robert had restrained Emma. Together with the USB recording, the case was gaining undeniable weight. But fear lingered. Dorothy's eyes darted toward the windows as though expecting someone to burst in. Frank, though, brash, shook whenever he lit a cigarette, his fingers trembling. "Daniel," Caroline murmured when they stepped out into the hall. "They're terrified. If Karen and Robert catch wind of this, they won't sit still. We need to think about protection measures." Daniel nodded grimly. "We'll keep them at a safe location tonight. I'll see that they're close enough for us to respond quickly if anything happens." By nightfall, the air had dropped to bitter cold. Dorothy and Frank were placed in a small, safe apartment not far from the station. Emma slept in Daniel's office again. Rex curled up faithfully by her side. Daniel himself lingered in the lobby, his instincts on edge. It was near midnight when Rex stirred, the dog's ears pricked, his muscles tensing. He rose from his spot beside Emma and padded silently to the window. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Then he growled deep and low. Daniel, half dozing in his chair, was on his feet instantly. "What is it, boy?" Rex barked sharply, the sound reverberating down the corridor. Daniel rushed to the door, his hand on his sidearm. Outside, under the pale light of the street lamp, a shadow flickered. The shape of a man loomed briefly at the corner before, darting back into darkness. Another set of footsteps echoed, quick and retreating. Daniel sprinted into the cold, Rex bounding at his side, but the night swallowed the figures, leaving only the sound of tires screeching as a car sped away. He stood in the middle of the street, breath steaming, fists clenched. Whoever they were, they had been close, too close. Without Rex's warning, Dorothy and Frank might not have lived to see morning. Back inside, Daniel crouched beside Rex, scratching the thick fur along his neck. "Good work, partner. You just saved lives tonight." The German shepherd wagged his tail once, then padded back toward Emma's side, resuming his silent vigil. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew now the stakes were higher than ever. Emma, Dorothy, Frank, all of them were targets, and the ones hunting them would not hesitate to silence anyone standing in their way. Yet in the middle of that cold Springfield night, one truth stood firm. They weren't alone. Not while Rex still drew breath. Not while Daniel was still sworn to serve and protect. The battle had only just begun. The Franklin County Courthouse stood like a stone fortress in the heart of Columbus, Ohio. Its marble steps stretched high above the street, flanked by tall columns that caught the winter light and turned it into something cold and unforgiving. At this day, the courthouse was packed. Reporters jostled with cameras, their voices sharp as they shouted questions. Curious citizens wrapped in heavy coats pressed closer to the barricades. Inside, the courtroom was already full. The pew-like benches creaked beneath the weight of onlookers, journalists, and lawyers. A faint hum of whispers filled the air until the bailiff's booming voice cut across the space. "All rise. Judge." Patricia Coleman entered, a woman in her late 52nd with short silver hair cropped neatly to her chin. Her black robe swayed as she walked, her expression firm but not unkind. Years on the bench had etched lines into her pale skin, but her green eyes were still piercing and quick. She was known in Franklin County as a no-nonsense judge, fair but intolerant of theatrics. She took her seat behind the high wooden bench. At the prosecution's table sat Daniel Harris, his broad shoulders squared, uniform crisp, his dark hair combed flat. Beside him sat Emma, small and pale, wrapped in a soft sweater Caroline had found for her. The child's brown eyes darted nervously around the room. At her feet, Rex lay stretched out, his black and tan fur gleaming under the lights, ears twitching with every noise. His amber eyes never left the people across the room. On the opposite side sat Karen Parker, clad in a sleek black dress, her auburn hair styled into elegant waves. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the grieving widow. Her face, however, was too polished, her performance too sharp for those who had seen the mask slip. At her side, Robert Hayes lounged in a dark suit, his stubble jaw set with forced calm. His blue eyes flickered with contempt. Between them sat their attorney, Avery Clark, a man in his mid-42nd. Clark was tall and lean with slick-back brown hair and angular features that gave him a hawk-like look. His gray suit was immaculately tailored, and his voice, sharp, calculated, had made him infamous in the county as a lawyer who would twist any story if the money was good enough. He had once lost a case defending a corrupt councilman and had never forgiven the public for scorning him. His bitterness had since sharpened into ambition. "Your Honor," Clark began. Once the formalities ended, his tone smooth as silk. "We are here today because a police officer, Daniel Harris, took a child from her legal guardian without permission. My client, Mrs. Karen Parker, is the rightful caretaker of Emma Parker. What Officer Harris has done amounts to nothing short of abduction, driven by ulterior motives. Concerning the Parker estate, Karen sniffled on cue, dabbing her eyes again. Robert leaned back in his chair, a mocking smirk playing at his lips. Daniel rose, his tall frame commanding. "Quiet. Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "Emma Parker was not safe under Karen Parker and Robert Hayes. They subjected her to neglect and abuse, and we have witnesses along with evidence that will prove it." Judge Coleman raised a brow. "Proceed with your witnesses." The doors at the back opened. Dorothy Wilson entered, her white hair neatly pinned back, though her thin frame trembled with nerves. She wore a simple navy coat, and her gray eyes darted quickly toward Karen before she looked down. Caroline Reed accompanied her to the stand, steadying her arm. Under oath, Dorothy's voice shook, but remained clear. I saw it. After the funeral, they dragged little Emma outside. Robert grabbed her wrist, and Karen carried a bucket of water. She poured it over the child's head. Emma was crying, begging, and no one helped her. Clark leapt to his feet. Mrs. Wilson, do you bear any grudge against my client? Perhaps envy, resentment? Dorothy shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Number? I was afraid, but I can't stay silent any longer. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Karen's hand tightened on her handkerchief, her mask slipping for a brief instant. Next came Frank Miller. He walked with a slight limp, his scruffy gray beard unkempt, his coat patched at the elbows. Yet, when he stood at the witness stand, his voice was raw and steady. I live in the alley behind the building, Frank said. I heard Emma crying. I looked up and saw Robert dragging her like she was a sack. She stumbled. Karen dumped water for her. I wanted to step in, but Robert glared at me like he'd kill me if I moved. I've lived hard, but no child should live like that. For a moment, even the reporters grew silent. Then Daniel placed the USB drive on the Comet evidence table. Your Honor, there is also this. The bailiff connected the device, and Richard Parker's weary voice filled the courtroom. Robert, what is this bottle of medicine? I don't need this. My heart races. My chest hurts. Karen, where did you get it? Robert's voice echoed. Cold, doctor prescribed. Stop being paranoid. Then Karen's whisper, unmistakable. Let him drink more. The sooner the better. The courtroom froze. The air itself seemed to tighten. Reporters scribbled furiously. A camera clicked. Karen's face blanched, while Robert's hands curled into fists. Judge Coleman's expression hardened. Silence in the court. Finally, Daniel called in an automotive expert, Gregory Mason, a man. In his early 52nd, with dark skin, close-cropped gray hair, and rectangular glasses. Gregory wore a simple brown suit and carried himself with the calm precision of an engineer. He had worked in 20 years for a car manufacturer and was now a technical consultant. In his deep, deliberate voice, Gregory explained, the accident that killed Mrs. Parker was not caused by brake failure as originally believed. The car's electronic control unit had been tampered with. Incorrect signals were forced into the system. This was no accident. It required skill and direct access to the vehicle. Gasps filled the room. Emma clutched her teddy bear tighter, tears welling in her eyes. Rex, sensing her distress, pressed against her leg, his ears perked and body firm like a shield. Daniel laid a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder, but before he could guide her back, Emma stood. Her small frame trembled, yet her voice rang out, soft but clear. If they love me, she said, pointing at Karen and Robert, they wouldn't have poured water on me. They wouldn't have laughed when I cried. The entire courtroom fell into silence. Even Judge Coleman leaned back, her green eyes fixed on the little girl, standing with her patched teddy bear and a German shepherd at her side. Rex looked up at her, amber eyes steady, as though lending her his strength. And for the first time, Emma Parker did not shrink. She faced her tormentors head-on, the truth standing taller than fear. The courthouse echoed with a nervous energy when the session resumed 3 days later. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the air heavy with the smell of polished wood and cold. Winter air drifting in each time the doors opened. Reporters filled the benches again, their pens poised, cameras ready, as if the entire county was holding its breath for what would unfold. Judge Patricia Coleman entered, her black robe flowing, silver hair framing her stern face. Her green eyes scanned the courtroom like search lights. She was known for her calm exterior, but those who worked with her long enough knew her patience was razor thin when faced with deceit. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant District Attorney Michael Grayson, a man in his early 42nd with dark skin, close-cropped hair, and a square jaw softened by a pair of rimless glasses. His navy suit was plain, but he carried himself with a quiet authority. Grayson had built his career on pursuing white-collar crime, and though calm in demeanor, he was relentless when presenting evidence. A rumor circulated that years ago, his own uncle had lost a business to fraud, which explained why Grayson despised those who preyed on family wealth. Daniel Harris sat beside him in uniform, his broad shoulders squared as though bracing himself for battle. Next to him was Emma, tiny and fragile in her oversized sweater, clutching her teddy bear as though it held her father's hand. At her feet, Rex lay with his head raised, amber eyes sharp, muscles taut beneath his black and tanned fur. The dog had sensed tension the moment they walked in. He hadn't taken his eyes off Robert once. Across the room, Karen Parker sat stiffly, wearing a black blazer over a dark dress, her auburn hair pinned back too neatly. Her pale skin seemed stretched, tight, and her mouth was set in a grim line. Robert Hayes, beside her, had abandoned any pretense of grief. His square jaw was shadowed with stubble, and his piercing blue eyes flicked with anger. He shifted constantly in his chair, the energy of a man cornered. Their attorney, Avery Clark, looked less confident than before. His sleek hair was combed back as usual, but the sweat at his temples betrayed nerves. He shuffled through papers more quickly than necessary, as if hoping he could still weave the chaos into something resembling control. Judge Coleman nodded toward Grayson. "Mr. Grayson, you may proceed." Grayson rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. He spoke evenly, every word deliberate. "Your Honor, after careful investigation, we now have the final results. Prescription records show that the medication Richard Parker was forced to take was purchased under the name Robert Hayes. Furthermore, maintenance logs from the auto garage confirm Robert Hayes signed out Richard's vehicle shortly before the malfunction that caused Mrs. Parker's fatal crash. These are not coincidences. They are deliberate actions, patterns of deceit, that led to death, abuse, and attempted theft of a family estate." He handed the documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. The room buzzed with whispers. Robert slammed his fist against the defense table. "This is a setup. Lies." His booming voice cracked, drawing a reprimand. "Order," Judge Coleman snapped, striking the gavel once. "Mr. Hayes, you will compose yourself or be removed." Karen sat frozen, her face drained of color. Her fingers clutched the hem of her skirt until her knuckles whitened. Grayson continued, unflinching. "In addition to the witness testimonies, the audio file captured on Mr. Parker's personal effects, and the technical report proving tampering of the vehicle, this new evidence completes the picture. The state moves for immediate arrest of Karen Parker and Robert Hayes on charges of poisoning, child abuse, and fraud." The judge's voice cut like glass. "Bailiff, secure the defendants." The bailiffs moved forward. One was Officer Randall Pierce, a broad-shouldered man in his late 32nd, with sandy hair and a stern expression. His partner was Officer Maria Lopez, a petite woman in her early 32nd, with olive skin and sharp dark eyes, her black hair tied back in a tight bun. Both had reputations for professionalism, but even they struggled to maintain composure as they approached. Karen stiffened as the cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. For the first time, her mask cracked. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her green eyes darted wildly around the courtroom as if searching for someone to believe her lies. Robert, however, exploded. He lunged up from his seat, spitting curses. "You can't do this. You think a bunch of liars and a USB stick prove anything?" Rex shot up instantly, ears flattened, a sharp growl reverberating through the chamber. His hackles rose, and he stepped forward, blocking Emma with his body. The low, dangerous sound silenced the room. Robert faltered for a moment, then was slammed back down into his chair by Pierce. The cuffs locked with a metallic snap. Emma flinched at the shouting, tears brimming in her eyes. She turned instinctively toward Daniel. He bent down, his large hands steady as he wrapped them gently around her shoulders. "You're safe," he murmured. She broke. Her tiny frame shook as sobs poured out, and she buried her face against his chest. The courtroom reporters, lawyers, strangers seemed to fade away. For her, there was only the solid, safe presence of Daniel and Rex, pressing his head gently against her side, a silent vow of protection. Judge Coleman let the silence hang for a moment, the gavel resting in her hand. Even in a room accustomed to drama, this scene held them still. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm. "The defendants are remanded to custody. The case will move forward to trial, but until then, Emma Parker remains under protective guardianship. This court stands adjourned." The gavel struck. The noise of the room returned at once. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, people rising to their feet. But within the storm, Daniel held Emma close, shielding her from the chaos. Rex stood like a sentinel, his amber eyes fierce, as they tracked every movement near the child. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, Emma allowed herself to believe she wasn't alone anymore. A month passed. The biting winds of January slowly softened, and Springfield streets, though still frosted at the edges, no longer carried the same bitterness as the day Richard Parker was laid to rest. Change had begun to stir, quiet, deliberate, but unmistakable. Inside the county clerk's office, Daniel Harris stood at the counter, papers spread before him. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Gerald Thompson, leaned forward with his reading glasses balanced low on his nose. Gerald was heavy-set with thinning blonde hair and a round face that seemed permanently flushed. His slow, steady voice carried the tone of a man who had spent decades pushing documents across desks, but he treated his work with care. "Officer Harris," Gerald said, stamping the last page. "The paperwork for temporary guardianship is complete. Emma Parker is now under your legal care until the court finalizes permanency." "Congratulations, sir," Daniel accepted the papers, his large hand steady, though his heart gave a rare tremor. "Thank you, Gerald." From the chair beside him, Emma clutched her teddy bear, her brown eyes wide and curious. She wore a knitted hat pulled low over her ears, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Rex sat at her feet, ears perked, his thick fur brushing against her boots. The German shepherd seemed to sense the significance of the moment, his tail wagging once as if to punctuate the clerk's words. Emma leaned toward Daniel. "Does this mean I get to stay with you?" Daniel knelt down so that his brown eyes met hers. "It means you're safe, Emma. It means you don't have to go back to that house again." Her lips trembled, but for the first time, her smile held no fear. A week later, the old Parker home no longer stood as a monument to betrayal. Daniel had purchased it with the intention of transforming it into something entirely new. Harbor Haven Center, a place for children in need, a sanctuary where no one would ever again be left trembling in the cold. The community responded with surprising warmth. Dorothy Wilson arrived first, carrying a bundle of fabric under her arm. She wore her familiar cardigan, her white hair pinned back, her gray eyes softened now with purpose rather than fear. "I can't build shelves," she said with a faint smile, "but I can sew curtains. Every window should let in light." Frank Miller came, not long after, a hammer in one hand and a box of nails in the other. His scruffy beard was neater than before, and his once hollow eyes carried a spark of usefulness. "I may not have much," he said, shrugging his worn jacket off, "but I still know how to cut wood, shelves, benches, whatever you need. I'll build it." Then there was Emily Carter, the town's librarian. She was in her late 22nd, with auburn hair tied neatly in a bun, fair skin, and clear hazel eyes that lit whenever she spoke about books. She arrived with a stack of boxes nearly taller than herself, each marked children's section. "Stories can keep a child alive in ways you wouldn't believe," she told Emma as she unpacked. "Every corner of this place should have a story waiting to be read." Others joined, too. Linda Johnson, owner of the Corner Cafe, showed up carrying trays of sandwiches and a pot of cocoa. Linda was in her 62nd, tall and broad-shouldered with laugh lines etched deep into her warm, dark skin. Her booming voice filled the hall. "No one hammers or sews on an empty stomach. Eat first, then work. That's my rule." Together, they set about transforming the house. Dorothy measured windows and stitched bright curtains. Frank hammered shelves into place, his calloused hands steady as if years had fallen away. Emily organized books and labeled boxes with neat handwriting. Linda bustled between rooms, feeding workers and scolding anyone who forgot to pause for a break. Emma followed from room to room, her teddy bear tucked under one arm, Rex, never far from her side. At first, she only watched, shy and hesitant. But, slowly, she began to help, handing nails to Frank, holding fabric for Dorothy, or carrying books for Emily. Her laughter, small and unsure, returned in fits and starts, as if she was learning how to breathe again. On Christmas Eve, the transformation was complete. The house glowed with strings of lights across its roof and windows. Inside, the walls were warm with color, shelves were lined with books, and the scent of cocoa and pine filled the air. A handmade wooden sign above the door read, "Harbor Haven Center." In the main room, the fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows across the walls that once held only echoes of grief. Emma Parker stood near the hearth, her small frame wrapped in the purple scarf Daniel had given her that very morning. Its color was bright and defiant against her dark sweater, as if daring the darkness to come close again. In her trembling hands lay a folded piece of paper, Richard Parker's last letter, hidden for years inside her worn teddy bear. She opened it carefully, her breath catching. Her father's handwriting sprawled shakily across the page. "If you are reading this, it means the truth has come to light. Trust Daniel, because I trust him more than anyone. And remember, Emma, you are never alone." Her tears blurred the ink, but the message burned into her heart. Clutching the letter to her chest, Emma whispered, her voice breaking, "Daddy, I'm not afraid anymore." Behind her, Daniel stepped forward, kneeling to her level. His strong hand rested gently on her shoulder. "And you'll never have to be afraid again," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here, not while Rex is here." At his side, the German shepherd let out a soft bark, tail brushing against Emma's leg, amber eyes glowing with a loyalty beyond words. Emma turned and threw her arms around Daniel's neck. The letter and teddy bear pressed between them. For the first time, her sobs carried no fear, no grief, only release, only the fragile joy of finally finding home. Around them, the room stilled. Dorothy paused with her sewing needle. Frank set down his hammer. Emily closed her book softly. Linda wiped her hands on her apron. The only sounds were the fire's crackle and the faint chime of Christmas bells drifting in from the street outside. Everyone in that room felt it that this was not just the rebuilding of a house, it was the rebirth of a life. Later that night, children from the neighborhood gathered in the new reading room. Emma, shy but glowing, led them. She handed out crayons, showed where the books were stacked, even taught a boy how to fold a paper star. Their laughter filled corners that had once been hollow with silence. When the others moved to decorate the Christmas tree Frank had built from old wood, Emma lingered by the hearth. She looked up at her father's framed photograph, resting on the mantel. The firelight touched his smile as she whispered, "Daddy, I read your letter. I believe you. And I believe in Daniel. I'm safe now." Daniel, watching from the doorway with his arms folded loosely, let his gaze rest on her. Rex sat faithfully at his side, tail wagging once, as if sealing the promise again. And yet, just as peace seemed to settle, a faint sound broke the moment. The creak of a floorboard upstairs. The house fell silent. Daniel's head turned sharply toward the staircase. Rex's ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Emma froze, clutching her scarf tighter. Because sometimes, the shadows of the past don't vanish so easily. That night, the Parker house was no longer a place of betrayal. It had become what its new name promised, a haven of light, a harbor of hope. But the battle for Emma's future was not over yet, and what waited in the darkness above would test every promise, every bond of trust, in ways no one expected. Sometimes, what looks like an ending is only the opening act of a greater miracle.